For as long as most of us can remember, the US dollar has been the undisputed king of the global economy. But lately, whispers are turning into real conversations, and it's all raising a fundamental question. Is the dollar's reign about to be challenged? Yeah, that buzzword you're probably hearing everywhere, de-dollarization. It all boils down to this one massive question. Is the dollar's era as the world's top currency actually coming to an end? Let's break down what's really driving this global shift. So, why all this talk right now? Well, it's kind of like a perfect storm. On one hand, you've got the really aggressive use of US financial sanctions, which has a lot of countries looking for a way out. At the exact same time, major emerging economies, we're talking about the BRICS nations, are actively trying to build their own alternatives. And of course, back home in the US, rising federal debt is only adding fuel to the fire. Okay, before we dive any deeper, let's get on the same page about what de-dollarization actually means. Look, it's not about the dollar disappearing tomorrow. It's really about a significant reduction in its use for things like global trade and finance, which slowly chips away at that constant worldwide demand for it.
To really get a grip on where we might be headed, we first have to understand how we even got here. I mean, how exactly did the dollar become the world's most important currency in the first place?
Well, this didn't just happen overnight. By the 1920s, it had already overtaken the British pound. But the real game changer? That came in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. It was there that 44 countries basically agreed to anchor their currencies to the US dollar, which itself was pegged to gold. And get this, even after President Nixon cut that tie to gold in 1971 in what's called the Nixon shock, the dollar's role in the system was already so cemented that it just stayed on top. Now, this dominance, it gives the US a massive, massive advantage, a power that a French finance minister famously called the exorbitant privilege. So, what does this privilege actually look like in the real world? Think of it like this. Because the entire world needs and uses dollars, the US gets to borrow money way more cheaply than pretty much anyone else. It's also shielded from the kind of currency crises that can absolutely wreck other economies, and it lets the US run huge trade deficits. But maybe the most important part, it gives the US the incredible power to use financial sanctions that really bite, because almost every dollar has to move through its banking system at some point. Okay, so that's the history lesson. Now let's get to the juicy part. What's the hard evidence? What are the actual signs telling us that this long-held dominance might be starting to shift? So the first place we can look is inside the vaults of the world's central banks. And the numbers are pretty telling. The dollar's share of their foreign exchange reserves has dropped from over 70% back in 2000 to just 59% today. That's a 2-decade low. Now, it's still the biggest piece of the pie by far, but you can see that other currencies are definitely starting to take a bigger slice. And it's not just reserves. We're also seeing that countries just aren't as hungry for US debt as they used to be. Foreign ownership of the enormous US Treasury market has fallen off a cliff, from a peak of over 50% during the global financial crisis down to about 30% today. And this isn't just some abstract financial stuff happening in the background. You can see it in the real economy, especially in the all-important energy markets. As JP Morgan's head of commodity strategy points out, a growing chunk of the world's energy trade is now happening outside the dollar system. I mean, this is happening right now on the ground. You've got Russia, which is facing sanctions, now selling its oil to Asia in their local currencies. Saudi Arabia is openly talking about pricing some of its oil in the Chinese yuan. We've seen Indian companies paying for Russian coal in yuan, and even Bangladesh used yuan to pay Russia for a nuclear power plant. Now, any one of these deals is small, but when you put them all together, they paint a very clear picture. Okay, so this all leads to the next logical question, right? If the world is slowly using the dollar less, then what are they going to use instead? What are the real contenders in this race for an alternative? Well, the name that comes up most often is China's currency, the renminbi. But let's be real, when you put them side by side, the gap is just massive. The dollar makes up 59% of global reserves. The renminbi is barely at 3%. The US has open markets where capital flows freely. China's are very strictly controlled. And maybe the biggest hurdle of all is just trust. The dollar is backed by institutions and a network of allies that the renminbi simply doesn't have right now. And what about the other options? Well, they've all got their own pretty big roadblocks. The euro, for example, is a strong currency, but Europe doesn't have a single unified bond market like US Treasuries. The idea of a common currency for the BRICS nations, it's still just an idea with huge political and economic hurdles. And cryptocurrencies, I mean, their wild price swings just make them totally unsuitable as a stable reserve for a central bank.
And this all brings us to the dollar's ultimate trump card. There is simply no substitute on earth for the US Treasury market. It's the world's financial bedrock. When there's a crisis, it's the safest place to park your money, period. And until a real competitor to that emerges, the dollar's core advantage is pretty secure.
So let's put all these pieces together. What does the future of money actually look like? Is the dollar about to be dethroned? Or are we simply moving into a world where it's just a little less dominant? It really seems like the future is being pulled in two different directions. In one corner, you have the argument that the dollar stays king. There's just no other challenger out there with the scale, stability, and liquidity required. But in the other corner, you have this vision of a more multipolar currency world, one where the dollar doesn't collapse, but it does slowly make room for other currencies, a trend that's being sped up by new tech and shifting politics. So when you weigh everything, the most likely outcome probably isn't some sudden dramatic event. It's much more likely to be a slow, gradual evolution. We're probably heading towards a global financial system that's less centered on the dollar, but one where the dollar still plays the leading role, just maybe on a more crowded stage. And that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. As these massive plates of the global economy continue to shift, are we heading towards a world with multiple currency powers and no single king? Or is the search for a new ruler just getting started? The answer is going to shape our world for decades to come.